Settlement often appears most stable when it endures without interruption. Structures rise, fields remain cultivated, and pathways between cities persist across generations. Yet the same continuity that suggests permanence can conceal a different constraint. The longer a system depends on maintaining equilibrium across fragile environments, the more its survival relies on conditions that cannot remain constant. Absence does not always follow invasion or sudden collapse. It can emerge from accumulation. Water sources shift, soil yields thin, and movement between settlements begins to slow. By the time abandonment becomes visible, the system that sustained habitation has already narrowed the range of possible continuation. What once appeared as resilience gradually becomes dependence on balances that cannot be preserved. Across the lowlands of the Yucatan Peninsula, the terrain does not organize itself around large rivers or continuous water flow. Instead, it is a fractured limestone platform where rainfall disappears quickly beneath the surface. Water collects in seasonal depressions, shallow reservoirs, and natural sinkholes scattered across uneven ground. Dense forest covers much of the landscape, broken by patches of cleared land where cultivation becomes possible. Distances between major centers stretch across tens or hundreds of kilometers, linked not by navigable waterways, but by overland paths that move through humid lowland forest. Rainfall patterns vary across regions, with some areas receiving predictable seasonal cycles, while others depend on more irregular accumulation. In this terrain, settlement does not cluster around stable rivers, but disperses across zones where water must be captured, stored, and managed locally. Within these conditions, movement and supply follow constrained pathways. Water must be collected during periods of rain and retained for use across dry months. Storage basins, reservoirs, and managed depressions become central features of settlement space. Paths between cities carry goods across uneven terrain where transport depends on human labor rather than animal traction or river flow. Agricultural zones extend outward from population centers, shaped by soil quality, and the distance labor can reasonably travel. The environment does not resist settlement directly. It limits how stability must be constructed. At first, this system compresses uncertainty. Rainfall, when sufficient, fills reservoirs that sustain dense populations through predictable cycles. Crops grown in managed fields produce yields that align with seasonal expectations. Movement between cities maintains exchange, allowing goods to circulate across regions with differing local conditions. The system appears balanced, yet each repetition introduces accumulation. Reservoirs require maintenance to retain capacity. Sediment gathers slowly, reducing volume unless cleared. Agricultural fields undergo continuous use, and soil nutrients gradually diminish under repeated cultivation. Forest clearing expands to meet growing demand, altering the surface conditions that influence water retention. What begins as localized adaptation gradually extends outward. Labor adjusts accordingly. Workers clear additional land farther from central structures as nearby fields produce less. Water collection shifts toward deeper reservoirs as surface basins lose capacity. Paths between settlements lengthen as nearby resources thin. The system continues, but the distance between supply and use begins to widen. A subtle shift follows. When rainfall aligns with expectations, reservoirs refill and fields sustain output. When variation occurs, even slightly, storage becomes uneven. Some basins fail to fill completely. Others retain water, but with reduced clarity, requiring additional labor to manage. Fields planted at expected intervals begin to show inconsistent yields, requiring adjustment in planting schedules and expansion into less productive terrain. Inland, movement reflects these changes. Carriers transporting goods between centers take longer routes to avoid areas where water sources have become unreliable. Resting points along pathways shift, sometimes disappearing entirely when nearby reservoirs no longer sustain regular use. Settlements that once functioned as intermediate nodes begin to thin, reducing the continuity of movement across regions. Infrastructure continues to expand in response. Larger reservoirs are constructed to capture more rainfall. Terracing and soil management techniques extend across hillsides to preserve fertility. These adaptations appear as solutions, yet each one increases dependence on consistent maintenance. The system grows more complex, not less. As populations remain concentrated around established centers, the demand placed on surrounding environments intensifies. Fields must produce not only for immediate consumption, but also for storage against uncertain cycles. Reservoirs must retain enough capacity to sustain longer dry periods. Labor becomes increasingly tied to preserving existing structures rather than expanding outward. Then the intervals between sufficient rainfall begin to stretch, not as a single prolonged absence, but as a sequence of irregular seasons where accumulation falls just short of expectation. Reservoirs refill, but not completely. Soil recovers, but not fully. Each cycle leaves a small deficit. The system compensates. Water is redistributed from larger reservoirs to smaller ones. Fields closer to reliable storage receive priority, while more distant plots are used less frequently. Movement between settlements continues, but cargo shifts toward essential goods rather than surplus exchange. Over time, these adjustments align into pattern. Storage becomes uneven across regions. Some centers retain capacity, while others operate at reduced levels. Movement between them reflects this imbalance, with routes favoring areas where supply remains stable. Peripheral zones begin to disconnect gradually, not through abandonment at once, but through decreasing frequency of use. Workers adapt without interruption. Fields once cultivated regularly are left fallow for longer periods. Reservoir maintenance focuses on fewer basins, leaving others to degrade. Paths between settlements narrow as traffic concentrates along the most reliable routes. The system persists, but its scale begins to contract. At the same time, the infrastructure built during earlier stability remains fixed. Large centers continue to require maintenance of reservoirs, terraces, and pathways designed for higher levels of activity. The effort required to sustain these structures does not diminish as supply becomes more uncertain. It increases. Distance converts variation into delay. A shortfall in one region cannot be quickly offset by surplus elsewhere. Transport requires time, and available surplus has already been reduced by local demands. Coordination between settlements becomes less predictable as each adjusts to its own immediate constraints. Gradually, more movement serves maintenance rather than exchange. Labor travels to repair reservoirs, to clear sediment, to stabilize terraces, rather than to expand cultivation or trade. The system directs its energy inward. Recognition begins to appear in the patterns of use. Certain reservoirs remain only partially filled across successive cycles. Fields closest to reliable water continue, while others fall into irregular rotation. Pathways that once carried steady traffic show intervals of absence. Yet these recognitions occur within structures that cannot easily relocate. Reservoirs are fixed to terrain where they were constructed. Fields depend on soil that has already been altered through long use. Settlements remain positioned according to earlier distributions of water and land. A question begins to surface beneath the adjustments. If settlement depended on maintaining a balance between rainfall, storage, and soil that is no longer consistently achievable, what form of continuation remains when that balance cannot be restored. Across the landscape, activity continues. Water is still collected when it falls. Fields are still planted where conditions allow. Movement between centers persists along the most reliable paths. Yet the distances between functioning elements widen. In some areas, structures remain standing while nearby reservoirs hold only shallow water. In others, pathways lead to fields that are no longer cultivated with the same regularity. The system has not ceased. It has thinned, and within this thinning, presence shifts. Not through sudden departure, but through gradual reduction in the frequency of use. Spaces that once required continuous labor begin to experience intervals of stillness. Maintenance occurs less often. Movement becomes occasional rather than constant. Across the lowland terrain, the same conditions persist. Rain still falls, though not always in expected patterns. Water still collects, though not always in sufficient volume. Soil still produces, though not always at prior levels. The structures remain where they were built, aligned to a balance that required more consistent accumulation than the environment continues to provide. Movement continues through them, but no longer with the same density. And somewhere within the forested expanse, where reservoirs once filled to their edges and fields extended outward in steady use, pathways now carry fewer loads between distances that have not changed, connecting centers that remain in place but no longer operate as parts of a continuous system. If this reflection resonated with you, you can find more explorations like this on Timeless Questions, where history, power, and human nature quietly intersect.